The polished floors of Horizon Insurance's office gleamed under fluorescent lights, their sterile brightness a stark contrast to the muted tones of Naomi Carter's well-worn blazer. She sat in a corner of the waiting area, clutching a neatly arranged folder in her lap. The faint hum of air conditioning filled the room, blending with the rhythm of keyboards and muted phone conversations. Naomi glanced at the receptionist, a young woman with a tight bun and an unreadable expression. The receptionist hadn't looked up since instructing her to take a seat, her focus fixed on the glowing screen in front of her. Naomi sighed quietly and shifted in her chair, her gaze drifting across the walls adorned with corporate artwork scenes of windswept fields and serene mountains, calculated to convey a sense of calm. But Naomi felt no calm. Disappointment, though mundane in appearance, carried weight. She had spent days organizing every document, cross-checking every detail, proof of income, medical diagnosis, tax returns. She had it all. There was no reason for this meeting to be anything but routine, and yet, a persistent unease gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. "Ms. Carter." Naomi looked up. A man stood in the doorway, his tailored suit pristine, his smile polite but distant. "Ethan Reynolds," he said, extending a hand that felt more like a formality than a greeting. "Come on in." Naomi rose, clutching her folder tightly as she followed him into the office. The space was clinical, almost oppressive, with its sleek desk and walls devoid of any personal touches. Ethan gestured to a chair across from him and settled into his own seat, leaning back with practiced ease. "Thank you for coming in," he began, flipping through her file with mechanical precision. "I see you're applying for individual health coverage. Why don't you start by telling me a bit about your situation?" Naomi straightened her back, her voice measured. "I was recently diagnosed with a chronic condition, and I need coverage to manage my treatment. I've reviewed your requirements, and I meet all of them. I've included documentation of my income and medical diagnosis in the file." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the pages. "Freelance graphic design, is it?" "Yes. I've been freelancing for 5 years now. My income is consistent, and I've provided my tax returns as proof." He paused, his gaze lifting from the papers to meet hers. His smile, faint and polished, seemed to harden slightly. "Freelance work can be unpredictable. Wouldn't you agree?" Naomi hesitated, sensing the shift in his tone. "I've planned for that. I have a steady client base and savings to cover unexpected situations." Ethan leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Planning doesn't account for everything, Ms. Carter. Chronic conditions can be expensive, and we have to consider the long-term sustainability of our policies. It's not just about ticking boxes." Naomi's grip tightened on the folder in her lap. "I understand that, Mr. Reynolds, but I've met your qualifications. I followed the process. What exactly is the issue?" His smile faltered briefly before returning, tighter than before. "It's about the big picture, Ms. Carter. We assess applicants holistically. There are patterns. We've observed situations where applicants might pose a higher risk to the system. I'm sure you can appreciate the need for such scrutiny." She sat up straighter, her voice calm but firm. "Patterns? Situations like mine? Could you be more specific?" The air seemed to shift, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. Ethan's expression flickered just for a moment before his professional mask slid back into place. "Let's not make this into something it's not," he said coolly. Naomi's chest tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Let's make it exactly what it is. You're using coded language to deny me coverage. Just say it outright. You think I'm a risk because I'm black." Ethan leaned forward, his smirk sharpening into something colder. "That's a bold accusation, Ms. Carter. I don't appreciate being called a racist simply because you don't qualify for our policies." Naomi inhaled deeply, refusing to let her anger rise. "I do qualify, and we both know this isn't about qualifications." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken truths. Ethan's carefully constructed facade wavered, and Naomi saw it a flash of irritation, of something raw and unmasked. "You've already been given an answer," he said finally. His tone clipped. "This policy isn't for you." Naomi didn't flinch. "Then explain why. Right here. Right now." Ethan's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his words lost their polish. "Because I said so. That's all the explanation you're getting." Naomi rose slowly, her gaze locked on his. "And that's why I'm not leaving." For the first time, Ethan's confidence seemed to falter. She could see the cracks forming, the unraveling of the control he had wielded so effortlessly moments ago. "This isn't over," Naomi said quietly, her voice steady, and as she turned to leave, the weight of his stare followed her cold, dismissive, but unmistakably uncertain. Naomi Carter sat at her small kitchen table, the soft morning light filtering through the blinds, streaking the worn wood with muted gold. Her coffee, untouched, sat cooling in its mug as she stared at the screen of her phone. She had watched the video twice already, her own face staring back at her with an intensity she didn't fully recognize. Her voice in the recording was steady, her words clear. "My name is Naomi Carter. Today, I walked into Horizon Insurance to apply for health coverage. I was denied not because I didn't qualify, because I do. I was denied because I'm black." She had hesitated there, her pause heavy with the weight of the moment. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, edged with a calm resolve. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been dismissed, disrespected, or outright denied because of the color of their skin. I'm not going to let this stand." Now, as the video played for the third time, Naomi reached for her coffee, wrapping her hands around the mug to steady herself. Posting the video had felt right in the moment, but now the flood of responses was overwhelming. Notifications scrolled endlessly across her screen, likes, shares, comments. Some were supportive, others cruel. "I can't believe this still happens in 2024. Stay strong, Naomi." Another race card puller. "Typical. Don't let them silence you. We're behind you. Maybe if you weren't so aggressive, you'd get what you want." Naomi sighed, setting her phone down and rubbing her temples. The buzz of activity online had become a dull roar in her mind. It was both validating and exhausting to see so many people weigh in on her experience, her pain, as though it were a debate topic. The creak of the front door broke her thoughts. Monica Hill stepped in, a tall paper coffee cup in each hand, her usual energy muted but steady. She placed one cup in front of Naomi and slid into the seat across from her. "All right," Monica began, her voice calm but firm. "I've got caffeine, and I've got a plan." Naomi gave her a faint smile, though her shoulders still slumped. "A plan?" "Yes, a plan," Monica said, leaning forward. "But first, how are you holding up?" Naomi exhaled, the tension in her chest easing slightly in the presence of her oldest friend. "Honestly, I don't know. The video blew up overnight, and now it feels like the whole world is watching me. It's overwhelming." Monica nodded, her expression softening. "I get that. But Naomi, you've been carrying this for a long time. Maybe it's time to let people see it. You're not just speaking for yourself anymore. That video, what you said, it's powerful. People needed to hear it." Naomi traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. "But what now? Posting a video isn't going to change anything. Reynolds and people like him, they don't care about shame or public opinion. That's why you don't stop at the video," Monica said firmly. "I did some digging last night. There's a lawyer, Darren Morgan. He's a civil rights guy, a real bulldog. He's taken on companies bigger than Horizon and won. You need someone like him in your corner." Naomi hesitated, the idea of involving a lawyer feeling both daunting and necessary. "A lawyer feels serious, like I'm declaring war or something." "Naomi," Monica said gently, "this is war. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for everyone who's been in your shoes. If you let this go, they'll keep getting away with it." The words lingered in the air, settling over the quiet kitchen like a heavy blanket. Naomi stared into her coffee, her reflection fractured in the dark surface. "You're right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't let this slide. I'll call him." Later that afternoon, Naomi sat at her desk, her phone pressed to her ear. Darren Morgan's voice on the other end was calm and measured, his questions deliberate. She recounted her experience at Horizon, each word dragging the memory into sharper focus. By the time she finished, her palms were damp, and her throat felt tight. "This isn't just about one bad manager," Darren said after a moment of silence. "This sounds systemic, and systemic problems need systemic solutions. If you're ready to fight this, Ms. Carter, I'll be with you every step of the way." Naomi leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "What does fighting this look like?" "It looks like filing a complaint, gathering evidence, and building a case," Darren said. "It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it can make a difference." Naomi closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But beneath that weight was something else: resolve. "Okay," she said, "let's do it." That evening, as the city outside her window shifted into the muted tones of dusk, Naomi sat at her kitchen table again. The notifications on her phone had slowed, but the echoes of the comments remained in her mind. She reached for her phone and opened the video app, watching her recorded words once more. "My name is Naomi Carter," her voice repeated, calm and steady. As the recording ended, Naomi felt a quiet strength rise within her. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew one thing: Ethan Reynolds and Horizon Insurance weren't going to get away with this. Not this time. Naomi Carter stood in the quiet reception area of Darren Morgan's modest law office, the faint aroma of coffee lingering in the air. The walls were lined with bookshelves, each crammed with worn legal texts and binders that seemed to tell stories of countless battles fought and won. The space was unassuming, but it carried an air of resolve like its occupant. The receptionist gave Naomi a kind smile and gestured toward the open door. "He's ready for you." Stepping inside, Naomi took in the sight of Darren, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, seated behind a desk cluttered with papers. He rose to greet her, extending a firm hand. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone warm yet professional. "Thank you for coming in. Thank you for meeting with me," Naomi replied, taking the chair he offered. Darren's office was a far cry from Ethan Reynolds' sleek, impersonal space. The desk bore signs of long-hour stacks of legal pads, a half-empty coffee cup, and a picture of two smiling children. Felt lived in, approachable. "Let's start from the beginning," Darren said, flipping open a notebook. "Tell me exactly what happened at Horizon Insurance." Naomi exhaled, her hands gripping the folder in her lap. She recounted the meeting in painstaking detail: the polished floors, Ethan's paper-thin smile, the way his words twisted and turned, always hinting at something unspoken. As she spoke, Darren listened intently, his pen occasionally scratching notes. When she finished, the room fell silent for a moment, save for the muffled sounds of the city beyond the window. Darren set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "What you've described," he began slowly, "isn't just a single act of discrimination. It reflects a systemic issue, one that likely goes far beyond your case." The language he used: patterns, sustainability, liabilities. These aren't isolated remarks. They're part of a framework. Naomi nodded, her resolve hardening. He didn't even try to hide it. It was clear he'd already decided I wasn't worth the trouble the moment I walked in. Darren's gaze sharpened. "That's what makes this case so important. People like Ethan Reynolds thrive in systems that allow them to operate unchecked. If we can expose that system, we can force change." "But where do we start?" Naomi asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. "We start with a formal complaint," Darren replied. "The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That gets the ball rolling. From there, We'll gather evidence, your testimony, any documents you have, and if possible, statements from others who've dealt with Horizon. Naomi hesitated. What if no one else comes forward? Darren's expression softened. You'd be surprised how many people have stories like yours but are afraid to speak up. Seeing someone like you take a stand can give them the courage to do the same. The words settled over Naomi like a blanket, heavy, but not suffocating. She nodded, her hands relaxing slightly on the folder in her lap. I'll do whatever it takes, she said quietly. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. Darren smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with determination. Good, because this isn't just about one case, Ms. Carter. It's about sending a message. That evening, Naomi sat at her desk, staring at her open laptop. Darren had asked her to think about anyone she knew who might have faced similar issues with Horizon Insurance. She typed out an email, her fingers moving hesitantly at first but gaining confidence as she went. Hi, I hope this email finds you well. I'm reaching out about a situation I'm currently dealing with involving Horizon Insurance. I was denied coverage under questionable circumstances, and I'm working with a lawyer to challenge their decision. If you or anyone you know has had a similar experience, I would appreciate hearing about it. Together, we might be able to make a difference. Thank you for your time, Naomi. She read it over twice before hitting send, her heart pounding. The act felt small, but it was a step forward, a step toward uncovering the truth. Over the next few days, Naomi's routine took on a strange rhythm. Mornings were spent fielding messages from friends, acquaintances, and strangers alike, some offering support, others sharing eerily similar stories of being denied coverage for reasons that didn't quite add up. Afternoons were for meetings with Darren, each one filled with new revelations that added weight to their case. One message in particular caught her attention. The subject line read, Horizon Insurance Denial, happy to help. It was from a woman named Angela Davis, who claimed to have worked under Ethan Reynolds at Horizon. When Naomi and Darren met with Angela a few days later, her words painted a damning picture. Reynolds has been like this for years, Angela said, her tone matter of fact. He doesn't even try to hide it. He talks about cleaning up the applicant pool, like he's doing the company a favor. Minority applicants? He denies them outright, no matter how qualified they are. Naomi's fists clenched under the table, but her voice remained steady. And no one said anything? Angela shook her head, her expression grim. If they did, they didn't last long. Management turned a blind eye. As long as the numbers looked good, they didn't care how he got them. Darren leaned forward. Would you be willing to testify to this? Angela hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. Finally, she nodded. Someone has to. People need to know what kind of man he is and what kind of company Horizon really is. As Naomi walked home that evening, the weight of what they had uncovered pressed down on her. Angela's testimony, the emails from denied applicants, the patterns emerging in Horizon's practices, it was all coming together. Yet beneath the weight, Naomi felt something else, purpose. The fight ahead would be long and grueling, but for the first time since that humiliating meeting with Ethan Reynolds, she felt like she had a real chance, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been dismissed, disrespected, or outright denied by people like him. She tightened her grip on her bag and quickened her pace. There was still so much to do, and she wasn't going to stop until the system that had failed so many was brought to light. The dim hum of the overhead lights in Darren Morgan's office felt almost soothing as Naomi Carter sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Darren sifted through a pile of papers spread across his desk, his focus unwavering. Naomi had grown accustomed to the rhythm of these meetings, the quiet intensity with which Darren worked, the methodical way he approached every detail. "This," Darren said finally, holding up a printed email, "is our next step." Naomi leaned forward, studying the document he offered her. The email was from a former Horizon employee who had contacted Darren after seeing Naomi's story. The words on the page were a mix of cautious professionalism and thinly veiled frustration, recounting years of subtle and not-so-subtle directives from management to scrutinize minority applicants more harshly than others. "It's not just Reynolds," Darren continued, his voice calm but edged with purpose. "The language in this email suggests a broader culture at Horizon One that doesn't just tolerate discrimination but institutionalizes it." Naomi nodded slowly, the weight of what she was uncovering pressing heavily on her chest. "So it wasn't just about me." "No," Darren replied, his gaze steady. "It never was. People like Ethan Reynolds are the visible face of a much deeper problem. They act as gatekeepers, but the system empowers them to do so." Naomi's eyes lingered on the email, her mind returning to her meeting with Reynolds, the way his smile had sharpened into something cruel, the dismissive tone he'd used to reduce her to a liability. She had thought, in that moment, that she was fighting a man. Now it was clear she was fighting something much larger. The following week, Naomi and Darren sat in a cramped conference room at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, presenting the preliminary evidence they had gathered. Angela Davis had provided a detailed account of her time at Horizon, corroborated by the emails and internal documents Darren had managed to obtain. As Naomi watched Darren explain the patterns emerging in the data, denial rates disproportionately higher for minority applicants, policies flagged by zip codes predominantly populated by communities of color, she couldn't help but notice the quiet tension in the room. The EOC officer, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a neutral expression, leaned forward. "What you're describing here isn't just troubling. It's systemic," he said. "That's exactly what it is," Darren replied. "And systemic issues require systemic accountability." Naomi felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, someone in a position of authority was acknowledging what she had long suspected but never fully articulated. Back at her apartment that evening, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open to a blank email draft. Darren had suggested she reach out to others who might have dealt with Horizon, hoping to uncover additional stories that could strengthen their case. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The thought of asking strangers to relive their own humiliations felt heavy, almost intrusive, but she knew that sharing these stories was the only way to shine a light on the broader problem. Finally, she began typing, "Dear friends, I'm reaching out to ask for your help. Recently, I had an experience with Horizon Insurance that I believe was rooted in discrimination. If you or anyone you know has faced similar issues, I'd like to hear your story. Together, we might be able to make a real difference. Thank you for your time. Naomi." She read the email twice before sending it, her stomach twisting with a mix of apprehension and determination. The responses trickled in over the next few days, each one a quiet affirmation that Naomi wasn't alone. One email stood out. A woman named Angela Smith shared how her application had been denied under circumstances eerily similar to Naomi's. "I had all the paperwork," Angela wrote, "but when I met with the manager, He didn't even look at it. He told me my income wasn't stable enough. Even though I had proof. I walked out of that office feeling like I was nothing more than a statistic to him. Naomi read the email twice, her heart heavy. Angela's words mirrored her own experience so closely it was almost eerie. She forwarded the message to Darren immediately, including a note, "Let's reach out to her." A week later, Darren filed a motion to subpoena Horizon's internal records, seeking documentation that might reveal the extent of their discriminatory practices. The legal process was slow and deliberate, each step fraught with resistance from Horizon's legal team. "They'll fight this," Darren warned during their next meeting. "They don't want those records exposed. But the fact that they're fighting so hard tells us there's something to find." Naomi nodded, her resolve steady. "What happens if we get the records?" Darren's expression softened slightly. "If we find what I think we'll find, it'll strengthen our case. We'll be able to show not just a pattern of discrimination but a deliberate effort to keep people like you out." Naomi's jaw tightened at the phrase "people like you." It was the same coded language Ethan Reynolds had used. The same language she had heard her whole life, always dancing around the truth without ever naming it outright. That evening, Naomi stood at her window, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. The weight of the fight ahead pressed against her. But it was no longer a burden she carried alone. This wasn't just about her not anymore. It was about Angela, about the anonymous stories filling her inbox, about every person who had walked into an office like Horizon's and left feeling less than human. As she turned away from the window, Naomi felt the familiar anger simmering beneath the surface. But it wasn't the kind of anger that consumed. It was the kind that fueled. The system was flawed, deeply and deliberately, and she wasn't going to stop until its cracks were exposed for all to see. The morning sunlight poured softly through Naomi's apartment window, bathing the small living room in a golden glow. She sat on her couch, her laptop perched on her knees, scrolling through an article sent to her by Monica. The headline struck her like a cold splash of water. "Insurance denial case. Is Naomi Carter just seeking a payout?" The words on the screen were both familiar and foreign. The article rehashed details from her case, but with a slant that felt sharp and invasive. It questioned her financial stability, pulling vague details from public records to paint her as irresponsible. There was even a mention of her social media posts, light-hearted comments twisted to suggest she was unprofessional. Naomi closed the laptop with a quiet snap and rested her head in her hands. The attack wasn't unexpected. Darren had warned her Horizon's legal team would try to discredit her, but knowing it might happen hadn't softened the blow. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up, seeing Monica's name flashing across the screen. "Naomi, have you seen the article?" Monica's voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency. "I saw it," Naomi replied, her tone flat. "It's everything Darren said they'd do. But seeing it laid out like that..." She trailed off, her thoughts swirling. "They're trying to rattle you," Monica said firmly. "It's a classic tactic, make you second-guess yourself. Make you afraid to keep pushing. Don't let them win." Naomi let out a slow breath, grounding herself. "I won't, but it's exhausting. Monica, every time I think I'm making progress, they find a way to twist the narrative." Monica's voice softened. "I know it's hard, but think about how far you've come. You've already got witnesses, evidence, and the public is paying attention. They wouldn't be trying this hard to discredit you if they weren't scared." Naomi nodded, even though Monica couldn't see her. "You're right. It's just frustrating. They've turned my life into a spectacle, and they're not even trying to hide it." Later that day, Naomi sat across from Darren in his office, the now familiar stacks of papers and legal pads surrounding them. Darren held a copy of the article, his expression calm but serious. "They're playing dirty, just like we expected," Darren said, setting the paper down. "But it's a sign that we're hitting a nerve. They wouldn't resort to this if they thought your case was weak." Naomi clasped her hands in her lap, her jaw tight. "How do we fight back?" "We stick to the facts," Darren replied. "Their strategy is to distract to make this about you instead of the systemic discrimination we're exposing. We can't let them succeed." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "The good news is that their desperation is showing. The judge upheld our subpoena, and we'll soon have access to their internal records. If there's a paper trail, we'll find it." Naomi met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "Then let's make sure they regret ever going after me." A week later, the subpoenaed records arrived. Darren's office became a hub of quiet intensity as he and his team sifted through the documents. Naomi joined them, reading through spreadsheets and emails that revealed the inner workings of Horizon's operations. One report in particular caught her attention. It outlined denial rates by demographic categories, showing that minority applicants were rejected at nearly triple the rate of white applicants. The numbers were stark, undeniable, and infuriating. "This is it," Darren said, holding up another document, a confidential memo from a Horizon executive. The language was cold and calculated, emphasizing the need to maintain profitability by scrutinizing applicants from demographically high-risk areas. "They didn't even bother to hide it," Naomi murmured, her voice steady but heavy with anger. Darren nodded. "This is the smoking gun. It ties their practices directly to discriminatory intent, and it's going to be a cornerstone of our case." That evening, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop. She opened her social media account, her feed filled with a mix of support and vitriol. "You're so brave. Keep fighting." Typical race-baiting nonsense. "Don't let them silence you. We need people like you. Maybe you didn't qualify because you didn't deserve it. Stop blaming everyone else." The comments blurred together as Naomi scrolled, her emotions swinging between gratitude and frustration. She closed the app and leaned back in her chair, the weight of the fight pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed with a message from Darren. "We've got them. The records are damning. Let's meet tomorrow to plan the next steps." Naomi stared at the screen, the words a quiet balm to the noise in her mind. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time. She felt like the tide was beginning to turn. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It was a fight for every person who had been dismissed, devalued, or denied because of the color of their skin. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The smear campaign had been an attempt to silence her, to make her question her own worth. But as Naomi stood in the quiet of her apartment, she knew one thing for certain: they had underestimated her resolve. Naomi Carter sat in Darren Morgan's office once more, the air around her calm but charged with a quiet determination. Darren leaned over his desk, meticulously arranging the thick stack of documents they had received from Horizon Insurance's internal records. Each page seemed heavier than the last, carrying the weight of what they revealed. Naomi reached for a document Darren had set aside, her eyes scanning the clean lines of corporate jargon. At first glance, it looked harmless, a policy memo outlining procedures for applicant evaluations. But buried in the sanitized language was something far more insidious. Demographically high-risk areas. Naomi read aloud, her voice steady but tight. They don't even try to explain what that means. They don't have to, Darren said, his tone calm yet edged with resolve. Everyone inside the system knows what it means, even if they never say it outright. That's how institutional discrimination operates. It hides in plain sight. He handed her another document, a denial report broken down by applicant demographics. The numbers spoke volumes. Minority applicants were denied coverage at nearly 3 times the rate of white applicants, even when their qualifications were identical. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the paper. These aren't just mistakes or oversights. This is deliberate. It is, Darren agreed, sitting back in his chair. And it's exactly what we needed to prove your case. This isn't just about one person's prejudice, it's a system designed to exclude people like you while pretending to play by the rules. Naomi nodded, her resolve deepening. What's our next step? We start building the narrative, Darren said. We'll use these records to show the patterns how the language in their policies translates into discriminatory practices. And we'll need to prepare for their response. They'll try to dismiss this as standard business practice or misinterpretation. But with what we've got here, they'll have a hard time convincing anyone. Over the next week, Naomi worked closely with Darren and his team, reviewing the evidence and preparing for the courtroom battle ahead. The office became a hive of quiet activity, each person focused yet composed. Angela Davis, the former Horizon employee who had come forward, was an invaluable part of the process. She sat across from Naomi during one meeting, her calm demeanor belying the weight of what she had chosen to reveal. Reynolds always used phrases like, weeding out liabilities, Angela said, her voice steady. It wasn't just him, though. That attitude came from the top. They knew what he was doing, and they let it happen because it boosted their bottom line. Naomi listened carefully, her respect for Angela growing with every word. It wasn't easy to speak out against a powerful corporation, especially one she had worked for, but Angela's willingness to testify gave Naomi hope and strength. You're doing the right thing, Naomi said quietly. Angela smiled faintly. So are you. Don't let them scare you. They rely on people being too afraid to fight back. As the trial date approached, Naomi found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The anger she had felt during her initial confrontation with Ethan Reynolds had evolved into something steadier, more focused. It wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. It was about exposing the entire system that had allowed him to act with impunity. Her social media inbox continued to fill with messages, some supportive, others dismissive or even hostile. But one stood out. I was denied coverage by Horizon last year. They told me my income wasn't stable enough, even though I had provided proof. Thank you for standing up to them. Naomi read the message twice, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and sadness. There were so many people with stories like hers, each one a quiet testament to the harm caused by Horizon's practices. That evening, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, drafting a post to share her thoughts. Her words came slowly at first, but soon they flowed with the quiet clarity she had come to embrace. This fight isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been dismissed or denied because of who they are or where they come from. The evidence we've gathered shows what many of us have always known. Discrimination isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's written in the fine print. But together, we can bring it to light. She hit post and leaned back in her chair, watching the city lights flicker through her window. The next morning, Darren called her into the office for one final meeting before the trial. He spread a set of key documents across the table, walking her through each one with calm precision. "This memo," he said, pointing to a highlighted section, "is one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have. It directly ties Horizon's policies to discriminatory practices. When we present this in court, their defense will crumble." Naomi studied the memo, her focus unwavering. "And what about their attempts to discredit me?" "They'll try," Darren admitted, his tone measured. "But the strength of this case doesn't rest on your character, it rests on the facts. And the facts are undeniable." Naomi nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. The weight of what lay ahead was immense. But she was ready. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was a battle for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or deemed unworthy. As she left Darren's office and stepped into the crisp morning air, Naomi felt a sense of clarity she hadn't known in months. The system that had tried to diminish her was now under scrutiny, its flaws laid bare for all to see. And soon, the world would know the truth. The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that carried weight and expectation. Naomi Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The polished wood surface of the table gleamed under the bright lights, and she found herself tracing the grain with her eyes, trying to focus her thoughts. Across the room, the defense team was a picture of confidence. Horizon Insurance's lead attorney, Richard Haynes, sat with a stack of pristine legal pads and carefully organized binders. He occasionally whispered to Ethan Reynolds, who sat stiffly beside him, his expression blank but his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on the table. When the judge entered, the quiet room became completely still. The sound of the gavel was sharp, echoing off the walls. "Court is now in session," the judge announced. Her voice was firm, calm, and deliberate, a tone that commanded respect. Naomi stole a glance at Darren Morgan, who sat beside her. His presence was steadying, his focus entirely on the task ahead. As he rose to give his opening statement, the weight of the moment settled over the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Darren began, his voice even and deliberate. "This case is about more than a single denial of health insurance. It's about a pattern of discrimination embedded within a system that claims to serve everyone equally. Today, we will present evidence that shows how Horizon Insurance systematically denied coverage to minority applicants, not based on their qualifications, but based on their demographics." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, allowing their gravity to sink in. "This isn't just about my client, Naomi Carter," he continued. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one is dismissed or devalued because of who they are." Naomi watched as the jury, an assortment of ages and backgrounds, listened intently. Their faces were calm, their expressions measured, but she could sense their curiosity, their need to understand. When Haynes stood to deliver his statement, his tone was polished, professional, and practiced. "The plaintiff would have you believe this case is about discrimination," he said, pacing slightly as he spoke. "But the truth is far simpler. Horizon Insurance evaluates every applicant based on objective criteria: income, medical history, risk factors. Ms. Carter's application did not meet those criteria. There was no bias, no malice, only due diligence." Naomi felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. Haynes's argument was smooth, but it skirted the heart of the issue, relying on technicalities to obscure the larger truth. The trial moved swiftly, each side presenting witnesses and evidence. Darren called Angela Davis to the stand, her testimony clear and composed. Mr. Reynolds used terms like cleaning up the applicant pool and weeding out liabilities, Angela said, her voice calm but firm. It was well known within the office that minority applicants were flagged for extra scrutiny, regardless of their qualifications. Haynes attempted to undermine her credibility during cross-examination, suggesting she was a disgruntled former employee. But Angela remained steady, her responses measured. "I came forward because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. What happened to Ms. Carter wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. The most powerful moment came when Darren presented the internal documents obtained through the subpoena. "These memos," he said, holding up a highlighted page, outline the very practices that led to Ms. Carter's denial. They describe demographically high-risk areas and liability flags, terms designed to disguise discrimination as policy. The jury leaned forward slightly, their attention locked on Darren. Naomi could see the impact of his words on their faces, a flicker of realization, a quiet understanding of the harm these practices had caused. When it was Naomi's turn to take the stand, she felt a wave of nerves but steadied herself with a deep breath. "Ms. Carter," Darren began, his voice gentle but clear, "can you tell us about your experience with Horizon Insurance?" Naomi recounted her meeting with Reynolds, the way his words had shifted from professional to dismissive, the coded language he had used to justify her denial. "He called me a liability," she said, her voice calm but firm. "He said people like me abuse the system." It was clear he wasn't judging my application, he was judging me. Haynes's cross-examination was sharp but predictable. He brought up her freelance income, her social media posts, and even her decision to record the video that had gone viral. "You seem to enjoy the spotlight, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone laced with insinuation. "Would you say this case has brought you the attention you were seeking?" Naomi met his gaze evenly. "The only attention I've sought is for the truth. This isn't about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the trial progressed, the defense's arguments began to falter under the weight of the evidence. The documents, the testimonies, and the undeniable patterns they revealed left little room for doubt. In his closing argument, Darren stood before the jury, his voice steady and deliberate. "This case is about power," he said. "The power to decide who gets access to basic human rights, like healthcare, and who doesn't. Horizon Insurance abused that power. They discriminated against Naomi Carter because of her race, and they hid it behind policy language and corporate procedure. But today, you have the power to hold them accountable." The room was silent as Darren returned to his seat. Naomi's heart pounded, but her resolve remained firm. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom palpable. Naomi sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the empty jury box. Across the aisle, Reynolds's confident facade had begun to crack. When the jury finally returned, the foreperson's voice was clear and steady. "In the case of Naomi Carter versus Horizon Insurance, we find in favor of the plaintiff." The words seemed to echo in the still room, their weight settling over Naomi like a wave. She felt her breath hitch, her hands trembling slightly as the foreperson continued. "We award the plaintiff $3 million in damages, $2 million in punitive damages for discriminatory practices, and $1 million in compensatory damages for emotional distress." Naomi closed her eyes briefly, a quiet sense of relief washing over her. This wasn't just a victory for her, it was a message that the system wasn't untouchable. Darren placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression calm but proud. "You did it," he said softly. "No," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "We did it." As Naomi stepped outside into the cool evening air, the weight of the trial lifted slightly from her shoulders. Supporters had gathered, their quiet cheers and warm smiles a reminder of why she had fought so hard. This wasn't the end. The fight against systemic discrimination was far from over. But for the first time, Naomi felt a quiet certainty. Change was possible. And this was only the beginning. The following morning, the headlines were everywhere. Naomi Carter's case against Horizon Insurance had become national news. Her victory a symbol of justice in a system too often designed to fail the vulnerable. $3 million verdict exposes systemic racism at Horizon Insurance. Landmark case highlights hidden discrimination in corporate policies. Naomi Carter, one woman's fight for accountability sparks national conversation. Naomi sat at her kitchen table, the same spot where she had agonized over sending an email or recording a video months before. Now, the world felt different. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages of support and inquiries from reporters. But for the moment, she let it rest, turning her attention to the steaming cup of tea in front of her. The weight of the trial was still fresh in her mind, the courtroom, the arguments, the sharp glares from Richard Haynes and Ethan Reynolds. Yet now, a sense of calm had settled over her. The verdict wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement that the quiet, insidious forces of discrimination couldn't remain hidden forever. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Monica stood on the other side, holding a box of pastries and wearing a wide smile. "Thought you could use a little celebration," Monica said, stepping inside. Naomi laughed softly, gesturing to the table. "I don't think I've had a moment to process it all yet." "Well," Monica said, setting the box down. "Take your time. But don't forget you've done something incredible here." Naomi nodded, her gaze drifting to the sunlight streaming through the window. "It doesn't feel real yet. I know we won, but it's hard to shake the feeling that this is just the beginning." "Because it is," Monica said, her tone steady. "You've opened a door, Naomi. People are paying attention now. And that means the system can't hide anymore." By the end of the week, the ripples of the verdict had reached every corner of Naomi's world. Messages poured in from people sharing their own stories of being denied, dismissed, or devalued. One email stood out: a woman named Clara, who had been denied health coverage under similar circumstances years earlier. "Your courage gave me the strength to speak up," Clara wrote. "Thank you for standing up for all of us who thought we didn't have a voice." Naomi reread the message, her chest tightening with a quiet mix of gratitude and sadness. She thought about how many people like Clara had endured the same struggles, quietly carrying their pain because they believed nothing would change. She typed a response, her fingers moving with purpose. "Clara, thank you for your kind words. Your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard. Together, we can keep pushing for change one step at a time. Warm regards, Naomi." Later that evening, Naomi and Darren met at his office to discuss the next steps. Darren was as composed as ever, his desk still cluttered with legal pads and folders. "You've become more than a plaintiff, Naomi," Darren said. "People are looking to you as a leader in this fight. Are you ready for that?" Naomi considered his words carefully. "I don't think anyone's ever really ready for something like this," she said. But if my story can help others, then I'll do whatever it takes. Darren nodded, a faint smile softening his typically serious expression. That's what makes this victory so important. It's not just about you, it's about creating a path for others to follow. They reviewed a growing list of potential allies organizations focused on healthcare equity, civil rights groups, and advocacy networks. Naomi's case had sparked a conversation, but it was clear there was more work to be done. The fallout for Horizon Insurance was swift. Ethan Reynolds, already disgraced by the trial, was fired within days of the verdict. Public backlash mounted as more stories of discrimination emerged, leading to calls for reform at every level of the company. Naomi read the news with a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about punishing those who had wronged her, it was about forcing a reckoning for an entire system that had thrived on silence and complicity. One month later, Naomi stood at a podium in a modest community center, speaking to a group of activists, former applicants, and supporters. The room was filled with a quiet energy, the kind that came from people determined to make change. When I first walked into Horizon Insurance, I thought I was fighting for one thing: my right to health coverage, Naomi said, her voice calm and measured. But what I learned was that this fight is much bigger than me. It's about every person who has ever been denied, dismissed, or told they weren't enough. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. We've started something important here, but it's only the beginning. Real change doesn't happen overnight, it happens when people like us refuse to stay silent. The room erupted in quiet applause, a shared understanding passing between the attendees. That night, as Naomi walked home, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she wasn't walking it alone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to find a message from Monica. "You did something incredible today. Keep going." Naomi smiled, slipping the phone back into her pocket. She looked up at the dark sky, her breath visible in the cool night air. This was the beginning of something larger than herself, a fight for justice, for equity, for dignity, and for the first time, she felt ready to face it.